Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Kress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying the book, The Ark and the Dove. More than that, I hope you're learning something about the Maryland colony, the first Roman Catholic colony in America, and how Roman Catholicism got its start, and our progressive learning as how we got from there to here. This Vatican control of our government. And we're talking about the time in colonial history when the Maryland colony was making a transition from the control of the Lords Baltimore to the Carroll family. Prominent Irish Roman Catholic aristocratic blue-blooded Catholics, the Carroll family, came to this country, settled in the Maryland colony about the time of the Protestant Revolution in Great Britain, and Protestant uprising took place in the colonies as well, and Catholicism began to suffer somewhat persecuted in this country as well as it did in Great Britain. And we'll continue where we left off yesterday. It said, although Lord Baltimore was deprived of the government of his colony, he still had some prerogatives left that had to do with his land interests. So Lord Baltimore's lost control of his government, and he's left holding some prerogatives regarding land in the colony. And it says Charles Carroll's term of office as Attorney General was not a long duration, but the Proprietary appointed him Registrar of Deeds, Receiver of Rents, and Surveyor General. He also acted as Baltimore's attorney and personal representative. So we can interpret from this that John Carroll was principally involved in helping Baltimore manage his landed interests in the colony. Now he goes on to talk more about Charles Carroll. He says he acquired lands in the province. Naturally, with these responsibilities, he would. And he said he named different tracts of lands that had belonged to the family in Ireland. So he's gaining acquisition, of lands in Maryland, and he's naming these different tracts of land after landed properties that the family held in Ireland. One of them was named Carroll's Forest, which consisted of 500 acres in Prince George's County, and was surveyed for him in 1689. Another one, Elio Carroll, 1,000 acres in Baltimore County, was surveyed in 1695, and soon later, Litterluna, in the same county, a tract of 400 acres. Another one, New Year's Gift, was surveyed in 1700. A plantation of 1,300 acres at a place known as Elk Ridge. And in 1702, he obtained other tracts in Baltimore County of about 2,000 acres. And 5 years later, he added to his possessions Similira, an estate of 5,000 acres in the domain of Dorregan Manor, of 10,000 acres. He owned also Enfield Chase of 10,000 acres. He also He owned also Enfield Chase in Prince George's County, and later other tracts in various parts of Maryland, amounting in all to about 60,000 acres. So this man, Charles Carroll, waltzes into the Maryland colony, takes care of the Lord's Baltimore's business, and becomes a huge landowner. Very powerful and influential. Now, I'd say somebody's setting him up for a project, wouldn't you? Certainly a very privileged man. It says, thus he became the largest landowner in the colony and founded a family estate that enabled him and his sons to render aid to the oppressed Catholics. He founded a family estate that enabled him and his son to render aid to oppressed Catholics, and his grandson to be of great material assistance to Washington, George Washington, and the American cause in the War of Independence. So we have in a Roman Catholic book by a Roman Catholic writer a discussion about a prominent, wealthy, and influential Roman Catholic by the name of Charles Carroll, comes to this country, comes to the Maryland colony, ends up with 60,000 acres, takes care of oppressed Roman Catholics, and his grandson became a great material assistant to Washington and the American cause of the War of Independence. Now, this is critical that we understand this. This Carroll family becomes a material assistance to George Washington, President George Washington, and the American cause for the War of Independence. This is setting us up for Carroll's involvement in the formation of our government and the fomentation of the Revolutionary War. And this is what concerns John Daniel. This is what seems to be missing in all Americans' understanding about the Revolutionary War. Now, like most of my listeners, I've always been taught that it was taxation without representation, that America wanted to be free and independent. But now it's beginning to look like the Revolutionary War was fomented so that Catholicism could operate freely in this country without the oppression that Catholics were under in Britain. After such a bloody history in Great Britain of the papacy's incessant attempts to bring Britain back under the popish crown, the Vatican saw an opportunity in America, in the colonies. Sent the Ark and the Dove, and with Protestants and Catholics both aboard, all seeking religious liberty. Jesuit priests on board to help minister to the Catholic spiritual needs, and obviously to do what Jesuits always do, form a government. And here we have, during this time of the Protestant Revolution, Charles Carroll coming to the colonies, getting all this land, and becoming a material support for Washington and the American War of Independence. Was it to get the colonies away from Great Britain's control? And if so, into whose control were they interested? The popes. Now, I've often told my listeners it was Ferdinand and Isabella who were commissioned by the Pope to come and explore and to seize all lands in this hemisphere for the Pope. And that's what he did. And then the Jesuits came to this country and established relations with the Indians, studied their religion or their occultic practices, established trade with the Indians, explored the land from coast to coast and from border to border, assessed the wealth and potential of this country, established Jesuit missions. Just in one example, virtually every 30 miles up and down the California coast. And it is extremely naive of us to think that during the colonial period somehow Rome lost interest in this country. It's more important for us to believe that having claimed this hemisphere, having claimed this country in particular for the Pope saw it as an opportunity to use it, to use this nation, to get in control of it early, to separate it from Protestant Great Britain, and to control it for a purpose. And I'll just add a prophetic purpose. And that purpose is given to us in Revelation chapter 13. And that's why I had Nicholas Arthur and Bill Hughes on the program to talk specifically about Revelation chapter 13. And we begin to understand all this stuff and put it all together, then you begin to comprehend that it really was Rome that was the primary force behind the War of Independence. Again, he says, speaking of Carroll, thus he became the largest landowner in the colony and founded a family estate that enabled him and his son to render aid to the oppressed Catholics, and his grandson to be of great material assistance to Washington and the American cause in the War of Independence. Now we understand that Rome has a greater mission than we would ordinarily have expected in this Maryland colony. And now we can begin to understand why the Catholics in the Maryland colony took such a liberated stand in Maryland, ensuring religious freedom for all religions. Because had the Maryland colony been organized under the normal form of Jesuit control, it would have much, much sooner excited the fear and hatred of the Protestants in the colonies. The colony would have been forcibly taken over. The Catholics would have been completely suppressed, just like they were in Great Britain. But the Catholics in the Maryland colony took the same strategy that they were given when they left the Isle of Wight in the Ark and the Dove. Don't get into any religious disputes with the Protestants. Keep to yourself and allow them to worship as they see fit. Because we've got a plan. We're going to the colonies. We're going to start a Maryland colony. We're going to have religious liberty. It's going to be a universally different attitude than what Rome has traditionally held in the world. and we're going to take control of the government. We're going to bide our time. We're going to behave ourselves for a time. We're going to learn to be trusted. And bit by bit, we'll get control of the country for the Pope. It's beginning to make sense more and more to me the more I study this. That Rome, ever since before the Revolution, has just patiently and cautiously bided her time. And now she's become so powerful in this country, she's not even trying to be so careful anymore. That's how come. That's the result of that is that now we can look at our government and we can see Vatican influence in it. We can see Jesuit influence in it. The most powerful people in our elected government, our quote-unquote elected government, are Jesuit-trained and Jesuit-advised, high-ranking Roman Catholics. Is this why Rome took such a cautious attitude when she founded the Maryland colony? Is this why the Carroll family provided material assistance to Washington in the Revolutionary War? That's the assertion. And that's what this author seems to indicate, revealing that this Roman Catholic, rich Roman Catholic, blue blood, and his grandson came to give material assistance to Washington in the Revolutionary War. And it says, until Maryland became a state, these lands were taxed to support an established church, that is, the Church of England, and a government that disfranchised Catholics and disabled them from holding office. So for a time, Maryland began to look a little bit like Britain. And it says, despite these unjust burdens, Charles Carroll and his descendants gave every possible aid and support to the cause of freedom and justice. Freedom and justice. Remember, true freedom in Catholicism is to practice the Catholic faith without any restriction and without any competition. And justice is whatever the Pope says it is. But now, freedom and justice has to take on a different attitude. Freedom in this case means religious liberty, that everybody can worship as they see fit. And justice is government by law. But anyway, it says, the third Lord Baltimore, who had not abandoned hope of ultimately returning to his colony, desired Carroll to live near him. He desired Charles Carroll to live near him. In one of his letters, he writes that his attorney is to have a large acreage assigned to him, quote, as near as possible to one of the proprietor's manors, for the benefit of his society. So we see a close relationship between the third Lord Baltimore and the Carroll family. It said he granted Carroll a tract of land and a brick house at the port of Annapolis, formerly Anne Arundel town, quote, in consideration of good and acceptable services and to enable him to continue in the performance of those services. So it was compensation. A tract of land and a brick house. Pretty handsome payment. He was of great value, obviously, to the 3rd Lord Baltimore. And it says, in 1693, the first Charles Carroll married Mary Dunnall, daughter of Colonel Henry Dunnall of Portland Manor, a blood relative of the Calverts. Blood relative of the Calverts, who reigned in Britain. And it said, Carroll received the appointment of the Lord Proprietary of Judge and Registrar of the Land Office in Maryland, succeeding Colonel Darnall, who died in June of 1711. In Lord Baltimore's instructions to be observed and pursued by his agent and receiver general in Maryland, Carroll is charged to pay in tobacco yearly various persons for their services. Quote, to yourself 12,000 pounds of tobacco. Remember, back then tobacco was a currency. 12,000 pounds of tobacco for your advice and trouble about my law concerns, and several allowances heretofore by me made to the several persons and officers hereinafter mentioned, viz., to Robert Brooke and the rest of his brethren, being in all 8 persons, 1,000 pounds of tobacco each. To Mr. Thomas Haddock, 1,000 pounds. Unquote. Now it says Robert Brooke and his brother were the Jesuit missionaries, and James Haddock was a Franciscan friar. So we're seeing a Jesuit and a Franciscan being paid currency, tobacco in this case, for taking care of the interests of the colony. And it says Carroll had trouble with Governor Seymour, who attempted to exceed his power in order to persecute the Catholics. Carroll had trouble with Governor Seymour, who attempted to exceed his power in order to persecute the Catholics, drive out the Jesuits, and confiscate their property. So we're back to the same mentality that there was in Britain. Great suspicion of Catholicism, and particularly Jesuit priests. And it says the governor showed his hand in a letter to the Lords of Trade when he wrote, quote, I must acquaint you that my instructions at this point are different from that of other governors, that other governors here have had. And it says theirs being to admit a liberty of conscience to all who behave themselves so as to give no occasion of scandal or offense in the government, but mine to all such but papists whom I take to be expressly excluded from that toleration, unquote. So here now we're beginning to see the normal Protestant repression of Roman Catholicism based on hundreds of years of persecution and government control and suppression and oppression and inquisition against Protestants. And if you're aware of Roman Catholic history, you understand the natural fear and hatred of the persecution the Protestants suffered. We'll talk more about it when we come back from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. Stay tuned for the message, and we'll be right back.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device and smartphone absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you wish to contact me, please email me at tom@seawaves.us. That's tom@seawaves.us. tom@seawaves.us. And also check out the website, inquisitionupdate.org. And if you would like to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program, and we thank Brother Nicholas for recognizing the value of this information and putting it on the air. Now, it says this gentleman's idea was that if Catholics gave no scandal or offense to the government, still they were not to be tolerated. And it said Carroll had enough influence to hold the obstreperous governor at leash. Charles Carroll had enough influence to minimize the level of persecution against the Catholics. And it says when Fathers Hunter and Brooke were brought before the governor and council to answer to the charge of consecrating a chapel and saying Mass, which was illegal, apparently, under this Protestant suppression of the Catholics, they were denied the right to have counsel. But the mere fact that Carroll had attempted to appear in their behalf and had advised them as to their legal rights was enough to save them from fine or imprisonment. So consecrating a Roman Catholic chapel and saying Mass would have ordinarily wound them up being fined and imprisoned. So this does look a great deal like Britain. Protestant suppression of Catholicism. And it says, after the Hunter and Brooke episode and the closing of the Chapel of St. Mary's, Governor Seymour, set about to enact a law that would have prohibited the exercise of the Catholic religion in Maryland. This was an act to, quote, prevent the growth of popery within the province, unquote. Now, why do they call it popery? because Catholicism is the worship of a man. Remember the vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God on earth? That's how Catholics see the Pope. He's the supreme governor of the universe. If Catholics will study Catholicism and learn the truth about Catholicism, they will learn the truth. That Catholicism is popery. It's not Christianity. And popery always seeks to snuff out the truth. Remember, the dragon gave him his seat and power and great authority. And it's the dragon who inspires Catholicism and causes men to worship men, causes men to obey men rather than God, replaces spirit and truth with idolatry, replaces sound doctrine with the traditions of men, replaces the heavenly kingdom of Christ with an earthly kingdom of the Pope. And Protestants, at least at that time, maybe not so much anymore, or quite obviously not so much anymore, the Bible and the Bible alone was their source of faith and practice. If any generation of post-first and second century Christians ever attempted to worship God in spirit and in truth, it was the Protestants. And of course, there were others that preceded them, the Waldenses, at least, and the Albigenses, who the papacy just completely obliterated, none remaining in the world. But if there were any at this time who sought to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience and the written word of God, according to sola scriptura, Scripture alone, it was the Protestants. And the man who is empowered by the dragon, the Pope, has always sought their annihilation. And this is the great fear and distrust that early Protestantism had of popery. They understood the Scriptures. They universally held the belief that the Pope was the Antichrist, as spoken of in the Scriptures. And they knew all the things that evangelicals are obviously unaware of today. And they suffered every imaginable and even unimaginable persecution by the papacy. It's not Christianity, it's popery. And they wanted to suppress popery in the province of Maryland, where its soil had been tilled and the seed had been sown and was beginning to sprout in the colonies. Catholicism, popery in Maryland. Even though it gave religious liberty to others, it was a threat, a mortal threat, to people who knew what popery was and knew of popery's history. And it said it prohibited priests, Roman Catholic priests, from baptizing any child except as had popish parents. In other words, no Protestant or no Catholic priest was allowed to baptize anybody but Roman Catholic babies. And it prohibited those priests from saying Mass or exercising any Catholic function, and from endeavoring convert any Protestant. It prohibited any Catholic priest or layperson from keeping school. Now, why was it interesting to prohibit them from keeping a schoolhouse, being a teacher, running a school for kids? Because in the schools, the Jesuit trademark is to build the schools, fill the schools with Jesuit-trained or Roman Catholic teachers, and teach them popery, not Christianity. Teach them that the whole world should bow to the Pope, the vicar and replacement of Christ on the earth, and that no government is a legitimate government unless the Pope seats its king and orders its laws. Now, if there was going to be any liberty at all in this country, it had to be free of popery. So it was understood, at least by the Protestants in this country, and surely the Puritans understood it, and the Quakers, that popery was a lethal cancer in the colonies. They didn't want them building schools and teaching popery in the colonies. And it says it prohibited the Catholics and lay from keeping school or taking upon himself the education of youth. This act prohibited private as well as public worship. For this reason, the Board of Trade for the colonies disapproved it. Okay? It says the Maryland Assembly thereupon passed a suspending act to the effect that a priest or Jesuit might exercise his functions in a private family or the Roman Catholic communion for 18 months or until the Queen's pleasure should be known. This was a check to the drastic policy of Seymour, and it came in response to a petition of the Catholic colonists presented by Carroll and the lower house. So Carroll's got his lawyer hat on, and he's desperately trying to preserve the rights of Catholics. And it says Governor Seymour complained to the Board of Trade that there were some in the Assembly who, quote, were a well-wishing party to the interests of Roman Catholics, unquote. He referred to the, quote, mediation of a great part of the House of Delegates, whose interest in land was considerable, to procure the suspension of the law, and hinted that both Catholic laymen and Jesuits had friends in the lower house. In another letter, he referred to Lord Baltimore's relations and agents who were using every means to propagate the Catholic religion, quote, being constantly supplied from Europe with Jesuits and give great scandal and offense to Her Majesty's government here, unquote. The scandal and offense consisted in the attempt to enjoy freedom of worship that had previously been granted to Catholics and Protestants alike. So there was a protest of Carroll's influence in trying to stop the suppression of Catholicism in the Maryland colony. It says the council consisting of the appointees of the governor sent word to the more liberal-minded burgesses that, quote, a toleration of such liberty taken by priests may prove a discouragement to my Lord Bishop of London from sending ministers in, unquote. The hope that the Bishop of London might send more ministers of the Church of England to Maryland may not have offered strong inducement to the members of the lower house to change their attitude, as the ministers who had already been sent had not been of a caliber or character that would have caused any devout member of the church to desire the arrival of others. Anyway, it says in 1706, when the time limited in the suspending act was about to expire, Carroll and the other Catholic colonists petitioned the Assembly to further suspend the operation of the act until Her Majesty Queen Anne should declare her pleasure without the limitation of any time. The Assembly took umbrage at this and declared the petitioners had no right to demand freedom and toleration, quote, seeing that at the time of making the act they had not the slightest assurance of such freedom or toleration, unquote, after the expiration of the time allowed. The following year, the home government had an act passed by the Assembly providing that the permission for private worship be extended without limitation of time until the pleasure of Queen Anne had been declared and signified. The small measure of liberty afforded by the Suspending Act was quickly taken advantage of by the Catholics. Many landowners built chapels adjoining their manor houses, some of which have survived to this day. Doregan Manor, built by Charles Carroll in 1717, has its chapel adjoining the house, which is still used as a place of worship by Catholic families in the neighborhood. Colonel Henry Darnall's Manor at Poplar Hill, 10 miles from Washington, preserved its chapel until 1929, when it was turned into a library. In the humbler homes, a room was set apart for religious worship. Quote, it was considered an honor for a family to have a holy sacrifice. There it is, the abomination, the Eucharist. They call it a holy sacrifice. It was considered an honor for a family, a Roman Catholic family obviously, to have the holy sacrifice, or the Eucharist, I'll just interject, offered within the walls of the home, and everything was done to give the room the appearance of a chapel or church, the temporary altar being decorated with wildflowers which the people brought in profusion. So each Roman Catholic home, if they had the ability, wanted the Eucharist served in their own homes, and so they built chapels out of one room of their house. And it says, the archives of the Maryland, New York province bear witness to the devotion and piety of the Catholic colonists who had to conduct their worship in their own homes. Now, let me just tell you, when the Roman Catholic government gets control, which they already have, let's quit talking about it like it's something that's going to happen in the future. Open religious persecution is going to take place. And we're already seeing people fleeing from the churches, knowing that they're government agencies now. They're fleeing their churches, and they're beginning to worship in home churches. And we've also seen in the case of cases in Arizona and California where these home churches are being persecuted by county and city governments with restrictions and permits that they have to buy. So prohibitive that it's impossible to keep them going. And if it weren't for some constitutional lawyers standing up in their defense, they wouldn't be able to worship in their own homes. I believe I read one or two of those articles on the program not long ago. Open religious persecution for non-Catholics. Those who want to worship God in spirit and in truth without being beholden to a church that is controlled by the World Council of Churches, an ecumenical council, a church that's corporated and has a 501c3 and has literally become an agency for the government. They want to be able to speak freely. They want to be able to pray and read the scriptures as they are written. And they're being repressed and suppressed by the government. But here at this time, Catholics were forced to worship in their own homes. And it said one record tells of a, quote, perpetual... Oh, this is interesting. It says one record tells of a, quote, perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, unquote, at one of the manor chapels, probably St. Thomas Manor. Now, for those who don't know, many of my listeners do, but for many who don't know, there are chapels that are built for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to put the Eucharist, the consecrated little round wafer of bread, in the monstrance, the golden sunburst fixture into which the Eucharist is placed, set it on an altar with candlelight all around, or spotlights, and then the chapel fills with people who literally come and kneel and pray to this piece of bread, who the Catholics believe is the literal blood, body, soul, and divinity, Christ entire, in the form of bread, to be offered as another sacrifice, a perpetual sacrifice in the Mass, to come and just worship that as a God. That's called perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. And it is the epitome of idolatry. And here we are in colonial times, that Catholicism, being true to its idolatrous characteristic, has already built a chapel during this time of what's the term they used for it? I don't see it here quickly. I'm trying to find it. I don't see the word they used. But it was a brief time until Queen Anne could give her approval or disapproval of what they were trying to do. So the Catholics took advantage of this time and began to build chapels. And they built one of these chapels for the perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Now that's something far and beyond just building a Roman Catholic Church. And it says, one record tells of a perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament at one of the manor chapels, probably St. Thomas Manor. There's a list of subscribers representing some 45 families who obligate themselves to employ a half an hour every month during the year on their knees in honor of the Blessed Sacrament, by mediating or saying of vocal prayers either relating to the Blessed Sacrament or the Sacred Heart, describing the activities that take place in these chapels. It says a list of the watchers of the Guard of Honor follows. The men are well represented, but the women are in the majority. The adoration was 12 hours long from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Quote, from the scattered and lowly plantations of Maryland, writes Father Hughes, the incense of praise, adoration, and spiritual mediation rose silently from morning till night. So that's what perpetual adoration is. Kneeling and praying to the Blessed Sacrament, the piece of bread. And it says the continuance of Irish immigration that was brought about largely by Charles Carroll. Now, why would Charles Carroll be so interested in Irish immigration? Because they were Catholics. They wanted to continue Catholics coming to this country because they were on a mission, just like our government is on a mission today. Then it was Irish Roman Catholics. Today it's Mexican Roman Catholics. Because we're in the process of Catholicizing America. Rome has always sought to have control of this United States, and the best way to get it is in the voting booth. To build and increase the population of Catholics till they reach from a position of minority where they have to act like meek as a lamb to a position of parity where they can be sly as a fox, and ultimately the desired goal and the reason they've had all this patience for so long and all this toleration and profession of religious liberty so that they could eventually grow to a majority status in this country where they can roar like a lion And so the Carroll family, being Irish Roman Catholics of blue blood and having great landed power and influence in the colonies, were interested in continuing Irish immigration to this country. They said the continuance of Irish immigration that was brought about largely by Charles Carroll was a source of great disturbance to Governor Seymour. He pointed out that the root of quote-unquote evil was the fact that the owner of the soil was, quote, the Lord Baltimore, whose agents, the Carrolls, give great encouragement to their seating here, unquote. Carroll, he indicated, had been particularly active. He suggested that more radical measures would have to be taken than mere duties poll to keep these Catholics out. Quote, unless something more effectual be ordered by Her Majesty, this province will by far have too large a share of them who in some few years may prove dangerous, unquote. How prophetic. Until something more effectual be ordered by Her Majesty, this province will by far have too large a share of them, that is Catholics, Irish Catholics, who in some few years may prove dangerous, unquote. And this is the thesis of John Daniel. This is why he recommended that I read this book and that I understand the power and influence of this early Carroll family and how they helped foment the Revolutionary War, populate this country with Catholics for an eventual purpose that is unfolding right before our very eyes today. Thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow. Stay tuned for Nicholas Arthur, Across the Border.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the Scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.